Hi and welcome back to a new video. Today we will review the RX 9060 XT in the 16GB version, which according to AMD, if we just look at the MSRP, should be cheaper a little bit than the 8GB version of the 5060 Ti of Nvidia. And I think that should be quite interesting, especially looking at my first results, where both cards in the 16GB version are roughly in the same performance when we look at raster performance. However, the AMD card will consume a bit more power and might be a little bit less effective in ray tracing applications. All details in today's video. The Seasonic Prime PX 2200 is currently one of the strongest PSUs available, and it comes with two native PCIe 5.1 connectors, which allows to even hook up natively to RTX 5090. That is perfect for any overclocking system or high-end workstations. I'm also currently running this PSU, and so far I'm really satisfied with its quality and performance. The cables are very flexible, there are also cable comms included, and in addition also a 90-degree ATX 24-pin adapter, which also functions as a PSU tester at the same time. The fan is semi-passive, and even at a high load it is still very quiet. Find all information about this PSU in the link in the description. Similar as with Nvidia, AMD also offers a 8GB version, but I want to make clear that I would absolutely recommend to always go with the 16GB version if it's possible for you when it comes to the financial aspects. Because even though the GPU is the same on both versions, it might be that you run into the GPU bottleneck when it comes to the memory if you just get the 8GB version. That will depend on your game, on your resolution and so on. But you will pay almost the same price for the 8GB version, so there's only, I would say, a tiny difference in terms of what you get. So I would definitely always go for the 16GB version to just avoid having a bottleneck and then not being able to play something at all. The review sample we received is a Gigabyte Gaming OC that has 3 fans. However, the PCB itself is much shorter than the card itself. But as most of the recent cards, you also have this, what they call screen cooling, so one fan can blow all the air directly through the heatsink. And also what I like is it's a single 8-pin connector. One more thing to note is that it comes with PCIe Gen 5 using 16 lanes. However, with a card with this kind of performance, you don't really need Gen 5. So you can also definitely use this in a Gen 4 motherboard and you will hardly have an impact on the performance. AMD is listing the RX 9060 XT in the 16GB version with a TDP range of 160 to 180 watts, which also means you will have to pay attention when you're buying one. We are testing a 180 watts version, which also means if you're getting a 160 watt version, you will see probably slightly less performance, probably also a little bit better efficiency. In the review guide, AMD is also comparing the 9060 XT 16GB versus the 5060 Ti in 16GB because Nvidia is also listing this with max TDP or max board power of 180 watts. Which sounds like the same, but you will see in the gaming benchmarks that it's actually not quite the same. Because you will see that the AMD card pulls always a lot more power, usually is like fully power limited with the 180 watts, whereas Nvidia consumes most of the time much less than the 180 watts. That is something you will have to pay attention to. The heatsink of this card is well sized for its power draw because with the 180 watts it wasn't really loud, so it was quite pleasant when it comes to the noise level, and also with the coil whine. I mean, with a 180 watts power draw, that's also kind of expected, but on this card I didn't have any kind of annoying coil whine. Now this is how the card behaves under load in this specific application, because you will see a slight change depending on your game. With Remnant 2, the GPU boosts to 3200 MHz with a temperature of about 55 degrees Celsius, hotspot about 77 degrees Celsius, memory temperature about 82 degrees Celsius. That's all I would say in a normal and expected range, while the card consumes about 180 watts. As I said, this is hitting like the power target most of the time. Sometimes it's a little bit above, sometimes a little bit below, but it's usually aiming exactly for the 180 watts. And as I said, if you have 160 watts version, you will see a slightly lower boost. But you might also see a slightly lower boost in different games. I also saw games with about 3000 MHz under load. But now we're looking into 3D Mark Timesplay Extreme GT1 for the simple raster performance. And here the RX 9060 XT with its 16GB beats the RTX 5060 Ti by 6% and is performing pretty well. Now if we change to the 3D Mark Speedway, which is more targeted towards ray tracing performance, we can see a 28% slower performance. than the 5060 Ti. And that's even slower than a 4060 Ti. Obviously, the ray tracing performance will depend heavily on your application, on the game, and how well it's optimized for the specific vendor. But I would say in general, you can still see that Nvidia is a little bit more advanced when it comes to the ray tracing performance. What we could also see in 3D Mark Speedway is a difference in power consumption. Here the 9060 XT, as I said before, is just pulling the 180 watts, while the Nvidia RTX 5060 Ti only pulls 166 watts, which is less than what it would be capable of. And exactly this behavior is what we can also see in the games that are tested in 1440p. Not as many as I wanted to test because of not having enough time, but I could observe that it's always the same case, that AMD is always pulling a lot more power than Nvidia, while both cards are listed at roughly the same power draw with 180 watts. In Assassin's Creed Mirage with max settings and without upscaling, the RX 9060 XT is delivering 2 FPS more on average, but also 5 FPS less in the 1% lows than the RTX 5060 Ti. That's also the reason why it's ranked underneath, because from my perspective, the minimum FPS or the 1% lows are just more important for a smooth gameplay experience. Again, we see this big difference in the power consumption to what is listed on Nvidia side and AMD side. The 9060 XT is again pulling the set 180 watts, while the RTX 5060 Ti is just pulling about 50 watts less at roughly the same performance. In Monster Hunter Wilds, the RX 9060 XT is quite a bit faster than the 5060 Ti, with about 5 to 8% more performance, with 54 FPS on average. But again, we have 196 watts power draw. That is 30% higher than Nvidia. Now, because the 9060 XT is most of the time running into the power limit, it seems to kind of be obvious, same as with the 9070 or 9070 XT, that undervolting will give you more performance because it will draw a little bit less power, so it can boost higher just because making use of the headroom in power targets. So we will also try it with this card. This is the stock condition in Star Wars Outlaws, where you can see that the GPU boosts to about 3050 megahertz. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. And now what we will do, we will open the AMD driver and undervolt the GPU by about 75 millivolts. For this, we go into the driver, performance, tuning, scroll down a little bit to GPU tuning, enable this, and pull voltage offset to minus 75 millivolts. Obviously, this will depend on your card. Some cards can do more, some cards can do less. Now, exact same scenario in Star Wars Outlaws, and you can see that the GPU is now boosting about 150 to up to 200 megahertz higher. And that's simply because the GPU is running with lower power, so it can automatically boost higher. So you're overclocking, well, the GPU is automatically overclocking itself just because it's pulling a little bit less power. In the stock condition, again, the 9060 XT was pulling its 180 watts, delivering 47 FPS on average and 39 in the 1% low. After undervolting, it still remained at 180 watts, but the performance increased by 2 FPS. I also tested this again with 3D Mark times by Extreme, and the difference is about the same. It's still small. With minus 75 millivolts, the performance increased from 49 to 50 FPS. Now, quick look inside this card, because I mainly want to see how small this GPU is, if we just look at this pattern. Especially if you compare this to other recent cards such as the 5090, it's so crazy how little this GPU is. For both the actual silicon chip and also the package, absolutely tiny. And then we have the 4 memory ICs around it and a little bit of VRM left and right. Very, very simple GPU. Again, we can see the putty that Gigabyte uses right now on the back of the GPU, and also again on the 4 additional memory ICs that we have on the back side of the PCB. Before we get to the conclusion, there's one tiny detail I want to talk about out of AMD's review guide. Review guides are normal, and usually you get them, no matter if it's Intel, Nvidia, AMD, you get them prior to launch being a reviewer, so you will find all kind of new information about the card, the specs, some testing, some expected performance and all that, which is usually quite helpful in terms of like not missing something or if you're looking for a specific detail of information. And now in this review guide, there was something quite interesting. And it's this letter to the press, where AMD hints that they want to promote transparent and independent testing. They state that they don't want to have any influence on the testing and they should be independent. And the only limitation to this is the date of the review embargo, which is today. AMD was quite smart in using all the drama around Nvidia to just highlight this by just not doing anything. And I can kind of confirm that AMD didn't do anything bad, like didn't have any influence or tried to have any influence on my testing. So well done and thank you AMD. What AMD also did quite well in my perspective is using Nvidia's bad pricing structure right now. So with the RTX 5060 Ti 8GB being more expensive, at least on paper, than the RX 9060 XT in the 16GB, that is quite a smart move by AMD. And I would always, any day, recommend this card with 16GB over the 5060 Ti with 8GB. And obviously also AMD lists an 8GB version, which I can understand from a business perspective because you will be able to sell them cheaper, sell more units probably. But from a consumer perspective, I would always recommend to get the 16GB version. To be fair though, Nvidia is always much more efficient. On average, 30% less power draw on the 5060 Ti at the same performance, which is quite impressive. And also, most of the time, Nvidia is a little bit better when it comes to ray tracing performance. At this point, I would usually also say that Nvidia is superior when it comes to the drivers, but we all know that it's probably not the case anymore with all the drama around drivers recently. But from my perspective, especially with the pricing structure, I think the 9060 XT can be a quite interesting card, and that can be quite a slap into the face of Nvidia, so well done. And I think it's a card that can be recommended. Thanks for tuning in, see you next time, bye bye.